Boa tarde. Queria primeiro agradecer a presença de vocês, a presença e o trabalho da equipe técnica, das tradutoras, obrigado. Agradecer a ANPOCS por ter pensado conosco essa mesa. Essa mesa começou a ser pensada justamente porque o Frédéric Lebaron já vinha para cá, e a ANPOCS me procurou para a gente pensar uma atividade. A gente pensou nessa mesa e, pelo que eu vi, essa mesa virou outras mesas também da ANPOCS. Então, talvez seja algo que se mantenha, porque é algo bastante, me parece, né, algo bastante interessante de se propor. Bom, eu queria, na verdade, o meu papel aqui é de ser a pessoa que faz a conversa. Segundo o Lucas, aqui eu sou... Quem que é? Jimmy Fallon, né, da mesa. Então, é esse papel que eu vou fazer. Eu vou fazer a apresentação do professor Lebaron em português. A palestra vai ser em inglês, então, se alguém precisar, por favor, nós temos a tradução simultânea. Depois eu vou conversar um pouco com ele em inglês, tá? E depois vocês podem fazer as perguntas de vocês. A gente vai abrir, vocês podem fazer em português. O Lebaron entende um pouco de português, então se fizerem devagar, vai dar tudo certo, tá bom? Muito devagar. E qualquer coisa a gente vai ajudando. Bom, então, só para fazer uma rápida apresentação, também destacar que o professor Lebaron está aqui junto com o Lucas, Lucas Page Pereira, que está aqui na minha frente, e a partir de amanhã, na verdade, com a professora Brigitte Leroux e com o Philippe Bonnet, também para participar de um workshop que nós vamos fazer aqui na Unicamp na semana que vem, sobre análise geométrica de dados. Então, também destacar isso, e fazer uma rápida apresentação para a gente começar a conversa. Então, o professor Lebaron é professor da École Normale Supérieure, Paris-Saclay, onde dirige o Departamento de Ciências Sociais, leciona também na Sciences Po Saint-Germain-en-Laye, desde setembro de 2014, na Universidade Paris-Sorbonne, desde setembro de 2017. É membro do IDHES Cachan, associado ao Laboratório Printemps, e também CURAP-ESS. Frédéric Lebaron foi presidente da Associação Francesa de Sociologia entre julho de 2014 e julho de 2017, onde ainda é membro do Comitê Executivo. Seus interesses teóricos atuais centram-se na integração das análises das estruturas sociais dentro de quadros de processos temporais, baseando-se a partir do trabalho de Pierre Bourdieu e das metodologias ligadas à análise geométrica de dados, numa abordagem metodológica e teórica com implicações substanciais para as ciências sociais. O professor Lebaron trabalha e trabalhou de maneira bastante competente, dedicada, com o campo dos economistas, de onde vem alguns dos seus trabalhos que são referências inescapáveis, referências importantíssimas na sociologia econômica, assim como também trabalhou e continua trabalhando com as análises metodológicas para as ciências sociais, com destaque especial para análises geométricas de dados. Eu também queria destacar um aspecto da biografia do professor Lebaron, que, embora seja um cientista extremamente metódico, sério e extremamente focado no trabalho científico, é também um intelectual que age e que intervém publicamente, desde o início da sua carreira, ainda com os debates sobre neoliberalismo, ainda com os debates de transformações, né, que se via na França e no mundo naquele momento, mas até hoje, e o seu último livro é dessas intervenções sociais, é o último, né? Uma dessas intervenções sociais, Savoir e Agir, as crônicas de conjuntura de 2007 a 2020. Ou seja, embora muitas vezes nós compreendamos e conheçamos o trabalho do professor Lebaron como um cientista extremamente metódico, extremamente compenetrado na ciência da sociologia, ao mesmo tempo é um intelectual que não separa a ação do cientista da ação daquele que intervém socialmente. Então, eu queria especialmente agradecer ao professor Lebaron pela presença hoje aqui e em toda a semana que vem na Unicamp, e dizer que, para mim, pessoalmente, aliás, não me apresentei, né, desculpa, Meu nome é Michel Nicolau, eu sou do Departamento de Sociologia aqui da Unicamp, mas, enfim, agradecer imensamente por sua presença e passo a palavra.
A lot of thanks, Michel, for this presentation. I'm really honored to be presented like this. I think it's something that one appreciates. Boa tarde a todas e todos. Eu agradeço muito ao professor Michel, Nicolau, Netto e ao ANPOCS pela invitação nessa conversa. And I stop now with Portuguese, sorry, so it was very short this time. I'm really thrilled to be here in Brazil, as always. I come rather often now, and particularly in Campinas, which I find really beautiful, especially the campus. I really love the campus. And in this very, very beautiful auditorium, amphitheater, which I also find really beautiful. And I've been told by Michel that this amphitheater is a property of the union, so I'm very happy of that. Okay, my presentation today will be based on a set of experiences in transnational survey research since the end of the 2000s. I first mentioned the debates and innovations following the Stiglitz-Sen-Fitoussi report of 2009, which especially has had conclusions around surveys on happiness and well-being. I will come back to that. That will be one of my points. We'll mention the elements of my participation to the creation of a European socioeconomic classification, which was based on tests with large official survey data in Europe, the most official kind of survey data that you can find, I think, at least in Europe. More recently, and I will speak, of course, a lot about that with colleagues like Lucas Paz Pereira, present here. I've been working in a project named Invent, which I will present a bit rapidly, which is particularly focusing on culture and social inclusion in Europe, but which makes a strong use of questionnaires, of survey, especially in 9 European countries. I will come back to that. It's an important recent experience, which we are now, which is followed now by publications and by a lot of discussions and presentation, including this week by Lucas. And I will also base my presentation on various other transnational experiences in survey research and data analysis, especially what has been coined the distinction studies, which come some years after the publication of Distinction in France and in the US. In the US, it was in 1984. And there has been a lot of survey research surrounding the issues raised by the distinction, including now research here in Brazil, in São Paulo, especially. I just mentioned here 2 networks, which have been very important in my case. The SCUD network around Annick Prieur, involving colleagues like Mike Savage and a few others, and a set of conferences named Rising Inequality, or Inequalities, to be more correct, which was about this issue of the dynamics of inequalities in the world. How do I see survey research? I see survey research, especially questionnaire. I will focus on questionnaires today as a reflexive scientific practice, and I think it's important to not to separate the methodological reflection that one can have from a reflexive anthropology perspective, which is more global, which can be applied to every sort of data collection process and every sort of data analysis, of data of any kind. So for me, what I will say tonight is in a sense transferable to various aspects of what we do every day as regards data collection and data analysis, and of course interpretation. And that's, I think, an important point. I will not focus on surveys as something very specific, very separate from other sectors of research. Now, to be more direct about survey research, and especially questionnaires used as major tool of surveys, there have been waves of critiques, of very important critiques, and especially a very important tipping point, in a sense, in French sociology, is the critique by Bourdieu entitled in French, L'opinion publique n'existe pas, public opinion doesn't exist, which is a quite tough critique of the use of questionnaire and the generalization of surveys in social sciences and especially in political science, but not only in political science. More generally, it has been published in a famous paper of Les Temps modernes and republished in many books, and it's quite well known in the methodological and epistemological debate on surveys, not only in France. More recently, there has been the prophecy by colleagues, especially British colleagues. I mentioned here Savage and Burroughs, but it has been they have been at the origin of a larger debate of the end of surveys, the end of questionnaire surveys, especially the fact that with big data, with the arrival of new tools, the arrival of new actors, and especially digitalized actors, we will finish by abandoning completely survey research, or at least survey research is in danger. Their prophecy was about the dangers facing one of the obvious elements that they had in mind was the fact that the response rates were declining, and it was more and more difficult to find people accepting to answer questionnaires, which I think is really a good point, because this technique really depends on the free will of people accepting to give answers, that is to enter in a particular interaction through the web or through any type of conditions. So my talk tonight is a bit about where do we stand? Where do we stand now? What can we say about survey research? What do we have new elements to add to the debate? Did this prophecy realize? I can immediately, and I think you will agree, you will all agree, say no. Finally, surveys still exist. Surveys still are very important, even in a sense more important than when they wrote this text. So it's a sort of paradox that finally there was no, not at all, disparition of surveys and disparition of that kind of tool. It's not exactly the contrary, but the picture is rather different. If I have to sum up my point, and it's a bit, of course, as any summary, a bit too rough, too raw, too brutal to say like this, but I would say that surveys, and especially surveys using this technique of the questionnaire, are a very powerful tool of investigation, and especially in the perspective of a global sociology that would now take seriously into account national, local, and individual variations. And that's our challenge, in a sense. We have to develop a global sociology now, because the society is global, and everything, in a sense, depends on elements and dynamics that occur at the global level. But at the same time, we don't want to lose the autonomy of specific levels and specific spheres, and we want to take into account the inter-individual variability of practices, attitudes, and the process that we investigate. That's the challenge. That's my point, in a sense. So very abstract and a bit maybe too optimistic, but that's what I will try to illustrate and argue about. One of the ways to do that, and you will not be surprised, I'm sure, is the idea that we should construct global social spaces, that we should refer to this idea of social space as a very heuristic and very powerful tool of investigation of social reality. So I will really stick to this element, which is, of course, fundamental in my practice of research, and I will illustrate as well this element. For me, this idea of social space is very flexible. It's powerful, as I said, but it's very flexible, adaptable, and it allows to try and answer a lot of questions, including integrating a set of various methods. First, here, I think it's a way to try and overcoming the issue of methodological nationalism, the limitations related to methodological nationalism, the fact that most of research in sociology has been national, situated at the national level, and in many cases has found many difficulties to integrate larger and sometimes also lower levels. The general issue could be summarized as how do we do now to deal with very various types of data, quantitative of various kinds. As you will see, in our recent project, we develop a lot of data collection processes, very various and very specific. And I think now we have to deal with that, the fact that we have the possibility for technological, but not only technological, for social reasons as well, to more easily get a lot of quantitative data. How can we integrate this data with qualitative analysis? And we know that sociology, like anthropology, remains mainly based on qualitative analysis. And that's a very important point to have in mind, to keep in mind when speaking about quantitative survey, because surveys are not only quantitative in general, and especially what qualitative research adds to our knowledge is very important and should be present in our minds when speaking about quantitative research. So it's, in a sense, the issue of mixed methods, but mixed method in a more systematic, I say very mixed methods in a sense, more systematic way, because we have also to deal with the issue of the variety of contexts of production of data. Now, we have a lot of possibility to produce data every day. I mean, there is a flow that is really huge, and possibilities are, in a sense, infinite. But we have to construct research objects. We have to be more and more reflexive. So I will argue in this direction that we need more, not necessarily data. We have them in a sense. We need data, of course. We need a lot of data, but we need more reflexive interpretation of the data. That's really my focus tonight. Here is the organization of the talk. So I will come back to this story. In a sense, it's a story to tell to people, which I think is interesting, which has some very interesting lessons to take into account, which is the story of the Stiglitz-Sen-Fitoussi report. Commission first and then report. Then I will move to the issue of objective and subjective surveys in international research, and especially the tension between or the articulation between different settings of survey research in public institutions, in the private sector, which I will mention in the first part a lot, and in the academy. And I think we have to be very reflexive about the conditions of production of surveys according to the institutional contexts and the sectors of the field from which they are produced. And finally, in a third point, I will stress, I would put the more insistence on interesting trends that I think as relatively new in international survey data analysis and research. So to begin, a few elements about the Stiglitz-Sen-Fitoussi report. Stiglitz-Sen-Fitoussi is the name of three economists who were heading a commission mainly composed of major international economists, which had should answer a question, which was, we need new indicators of social progress. We have to measure social progress. Why do I mention this commission? Because it was very important in the history of debates in public and more generally in social statistics as a point where things were being discussed, and especially economists began to say, they already began before, but at that time it became very intense, that GDP, for example, is not enough, is clearly has many limitations, has many problems, and we should invent new social indicators, new social data, especially as regards the quality of life. It was also very much about environment. Environment was already very present at that time, and is still, of course, and is even much more present today as something that puts into question the relevance of the tools that we have inherited the history of social sciences, especially the macroeconomic indicators, the general aggregates that we use, all the indicators that the statistical indicators that we commonly use in social sciences were being put into question by this commission. So very interesting. And they finally came to many conclusions. I will just focus on the conclusions relating to the issue of the quality of life, which was the second part of the report. One of the big conclusions was we don't have enough survey data. We don't have enough social data to understand what is at stake in our societies. and especially as regards the issue of happiness, quality of life, well-being, conditions of life, living conditions in general. All that is not that well known because we lack an information system, a system of information, of social information. So it was very important. These mainstream economists were telling us that we should invest in social sciences survey a lot. They also had a very interesting conclusion from my point of view, which was that one should also develop a multi-criteria and even multi-dimensional analysis of our social reality. That was one of their conclusions, and not trying to replace GDP or GDP per inhabitant or anything related to GDP by another unique indicator. That's not the right way to proceed in social sciences, and especially when it's about quality of life. Very interesting conclusion, I think. Very interesting for us. So one needs to be inventive and not to reduce the reality to unidimensional indicators. And you will see one of the problems of the effect of the report is that that's very difficult, actually. That's something that is quite challenging. They also said we should promote debates and interactive, participative implication of citizens in the discussion about what is well-being, what is happiness, of course. We should take into account the fact that they have their systems of preferences and that there should be a democratic debate, very large in our societies at the global level about these issues, which are the issue of what do we want to do in public policies, of course, but more generally in organizations to improve our lives. So they discuss that on the big heading of social progress, which is a bit very large and vague, but they really take seriously the idea that one all have as an issue, this issue of what is collective social progress, and one should discuss the way to measure it. The effects, finally, of this report were rather disappointing in the sense that we are very far from the statistical revolution that Jean-Paul Fitoussi, late Jean-Paul Fitoussi, he died 2 years ago, wanted to promote a statistical revolution. He thought that really with the Stiglitz report, all the production of information about societies would change, and would change in a sense that would create political change. Because if one changes the indicators, if one changes the objectives, one would change the dynamics of the society and the political climate. It was over-optimistic, obviously, and 2 years or 3 years after the report, he admitted that we were far from the initial objectives. But it had some consequences. One of the consequences, as you will see, is the development of new surveys or new types of surveys, and especially around happiness. And probably the big success after the Stiglitz and Fitoussi report is the generalization of surveys on happiness. And I will show you some examples and discuss some of the issues that relate to this sector of research. What is more important for me, and I insisted a lot at that time on this issue, was the fact that with the Stiglitz and Fitoussi report, we had this idea that we should develop, our societies should promote a general system of social information that would integrate both objective elements, especially elements centered on the issues of capital at various levels, from the individual to the collective, including physical, environmental capital, social capital, human capital, and so on. That was, I recall that economists were leading the operation, but they had a rather general and diverse notion of capitals that should be integrated in this system of information. But one should also develop measures of subjective elements, the way people perceive, the way people have affects, the way people represent themselves, their world, their living conditions, and so on. So this is, in a sense, a utopia, but a very, I think, interesting utopia for us sociologists or social scientists, more largely, which is the idea to base our analysis on a coherent, consistent system of information that will be developed. In reality, the changes were rather limited. There are some elements that I will not show today. It's not the object, but except one, I will come back on the World Happiness Report, which is one of the big conclusions and which is probably the most mediatized and popularized survey today in the world, which every year gives a measurement of happiness in a set of countries. Among the positive changes, there was a reform of the HDI, for example, at the UNPD, very important, with new ways to measure wealth, especially to measure income and not production, a shift from measuring production to measuring what people really get, which is very different. And that was a big conclusion of the Stiglitz-Sen-Fitoussi report. There is the OECD Better Life Initiative, which you may know, which is very interesting. Have a look at the website of the OECD. It's very interesting because they wanted to create a tool which would be interactive, where you could change the weights with which you calculate the well-being of a nation, or even at other levels if possible. The changes in public statistics were quite limited because of the resistance, in a sense, of the profession of statisticians in the public sector to radical change, and the fact that we need a continuity of indicators. There are many reasons for which the revolution didn't occur. One of these reasons being austerity, policy reducing the budget, reduce as well the possibility of having surveys, because surveys cost money. It's an investment that a society must make. So one of the big conclusions was the development of survey research in economics of happiness. And it's really something that probably many social scientists don't have in mind. That's the really amazing and challenging and really interesting success of the idea that we should develop at a global level surveys where we ask people if they are satisfied with their lives, and we should try to correlate and to causally explain why they are or they are not happy. So the methodology of questionnaires is really at the center of the process. And so in a sense, it contradicts the prophecy of Savage-and Burroughs with the Stiglitz-Sen-Fitoussi report. So a bit after, at the same time as their second article, there was an impulsion, movement towards the development of surveys, and the development of surveys where you ask people if what is their level of satisfaction in life. I will come back to the way it's measured. It's numerically measured. It's measured on a scale. So it's a success of scales as well, this success of questionnaire methodology. And in the same period, the methodology of questionnaires has standardized since the years 2000. Let's give a rather broad indication, but with the use of scales, of numerical scales. This generalization of numerical scales is a really very important methodological issue. And I think that the example of happiness is really, from a pedagogical and from a public policy point of view, very important and very instructive, and should be discussed among us. Of course, among the classical questions in the economy of happiness, which is quite far from what we do as sociologists or anthropologists, there is this issue of does wealth lead to happiness? In fact, get higher incomes or to be able to accumulate capital, does it lead to well-being and happiness? There is a lot of production, bibliography, references on that. We'll just go rapidly to the questions. For me, it's important to be reflexive again and to submit this success to a reflexive anthropology point of view. First, with a very simple and trivial, in a sense, question, but which is very huge and very difficult to answer, which is the idea of universality of happiness and even of well-being, in a sense. Are these notions really universal? Is it possible to measure for the entire humanity something called happiness? Very big question. But there are classical methodological questions as well that are integrated to the literature, of course. I'm not the first one asking that, it's obvious. For example, all the biases of the questionnaire, which are well known in a sense. So I just cite here the social desirability bias, but there are many biases like that. For me, the biases usually relate to many things, to the fact that a questionnaire is a linguistic operation. So there may be a lot of ambiguities with the words that are used, very important. And when you answer a questionnaire, you have incorporated norms. You're interacting, but you're not interacting from nowhere. You're someone that has internalized dispositions, norms, visions, which define certain concepts a certain way, or which leads you to answering a questionnaire a certain way. And for example, there is a big result of the economics of happiness that is really robust in terms of correlations in most of all the surveys. Women are more happy than men. Okay, in these questionnaires, which for me obviously relates to something that is much more complex than the simple idea that it's like that, and we should interpret that in terms of subjectivity, of something that the data give us, but without the background of the relation between men and women, for example, which is the basic element, social relation, power relation, the fact that this issue is not answered in a space, that a sort of vacuum, a space that should be analyzed without power, domination relations and norms internalized by the people who answer the questionnaire. I go a bit quicker now. Other point, the numerical reduction, is it really a way to understand happiness? And I will show you that it creates some inconsistencies in a sense. The fact that you ask people to say, well, from 0 to 10, what is your level of happiness? Seems very, in a sense, very simple. And it comes from psychology, it comes from medicine. It's something that is practiced in tests. So it has a sort of positivist legitimacy, but it is really questionable in the case of social survey research. At least it's something that should be really carefully and critically analyzed. What is exactly the meaning of the number we produce, like that? Of the number you produce yourself while sticking on a case, saying my level of happiness is 6, my level of life satisfaction, actually, because the question is usually a question on life satisfaction. For econometric research, it's something very simple, and in a sense, it has created solutions to many problems. You have a way to measure happiness everywhere for everybody, so in many very diverse conditions, and you have the methodology of regression, so you try to analyze what are the causal factors of this level. So you have the ideal dependent variable for your models. But is it really what we have to do with happiness? Or don't we prefer, in the spirit of the Stiglitz-Fitoussi report, to have a multidimensional vision of happiness, for example? That there are different types of happiness. And so that we should investigate a space of happiness, a social space of happiness, with various norms that are at the origin of various definitions of happiness in various social conditions. Why do I say that? Because I've read a lot in this field, and for example, read articles which really puzzled me. I mean, I was really intrigued and even skeptical with the idea that, for example, French people are more unhappy than others. Actually, when you look at the data, it's not that obvious. Other things being equal, at the same level of income, at the same level of many things, it seems that the French are more unhappy. And one of the major hypotheses that has been developed in the literature is the fact that it relates to the labor market, and it relates to confidence on the labor market and issues in the labor market. But is it the way we should ask the questions? Is it really what we want to measure? Just to show you how much it's problematic, I will very rapidly, because I'm going a bit too slow, showing you some elements from results from the Gallup survey, because Gallup is clearly the company that is behind the success of happiness research. And so it's a private company which has had a big role in survey research. In 2006, you see that France had a 7, which is not so bad. I mean, compared to Denmark, which at that time was one of the best, and is still, in terms of happiness, 8, whereas Turkey at that time was a bit under 5. Okay. I just mentioned here the correlations. They are very robust in the literature. You find them in a lot of studies now. What is striking is a relatively strong stability over time. Changes are very, very slow and very limited. And so, in a sense, it's an argument for the robustness, but it's not an argument for is it interpretable? Because if it's so stable, what do we really measure with that? We don't really know. I just show you the conclusions of the World Happiness Report 2023, showing that, of course, there is a day of happiness now. Okay, so one of the results of the Stiglitz and Fitoussi report may be that there is a UN day for happiness. And if you didn't know, now you know that the 20 March is the day of happiness. And at that day, you have the publication of the report of the World Happiness Report, which is based on a very large global survey, and which every year gives you an account of what is happening in the sphere of happiness. You have here the major results this year, and it's puzzling and even striking that the first conclusion is that there was more or less no change with the COVID. Wow, seems a bit strange. No change in happiness in the world. It's a result, and I just copied and pasted the web page. So it's not me. I didn't write that. Finland remains at the top position. So you know now, if you didn't know, that Finns are the most happy in the world for the 6th year in a row, and that Afghanistan has a bad mark, and Lebanon too. And unfortunately, may think that it will not change in the future for Lebanon. You have elements on inequality, but inequality here again is measured in terms of level of happiness. So you will first define inequality in this perspective as the inequality between the ones that are happy and the ones that are not. And so what they correlate is the level of inequality of happiness correlates to the general level of happiness. So societies that are more equal in terms of happiness are more happy in general. Okay, it's quite interesting. But what happened, and it's for me an interesting event, the same year and at more or less the same date, and it also relates to this day of happiness that is a UN day, you had the publication not of the World Happiness Report, but the Global Happiness Report, this time produced by Ipsos, so another company, another big company. And what do they say? They say in 2023, the Chinese are the most happy, okay? And Brazilians are much more happy than the French, for example. 83% compared to 74%. So you may be happy to know that you're more happy than the French. What is striking here is the fact that the global south, and especially the emerging countries, the BRICS countries and so on, are much more happy with this survey than in the World Happiness Report. Why? Because it's not measured the same way, that's all. Because the way you ask the question is different. You ask directly, are you happy or not? And you have only categories, I think 5 categories, if I remember well. And you say a nation is happy if the proportion of people answering, I am very or I am rather happy, is the most important. So it's China now, where the proportion of people being either rather or very happy is the most important. It's another definition of happiness. Ipsos didn't comment a lot on that because I think they were very not at ease with the result, which was, of course, very striking, and the result was not commented. You will search for media that commented on it. I'm probably one of the only persons in an article of Le Monde Diplomatique to have mentioned that, ironically, that it's not discussed. We don't discuss that because it creates something that means that the way we measure happiness is maybe not the only one, and if you measure another way, it may create discrepancies or inconsistencies. Okay, so for happiness and subjective questions, it seems that it's maybe not a dead end, but something that should be complemented at least. And complemented by what? For me, by objective variations. We should have surveys and investigations of the distribution of assets, the distribution of resources and capitals. And I think this idea of the Stiglitz and Fitoussi report was really very important. I will also mention, you will see a bit later, that we should also need surveys on practices and activities. And I think it's the triad of surveys, to speak a bit like Vacan. Attitudes, subjective questions are important, but must be contextualized and analyzed critically. I didn't make the analysis to explain why China can be, well, appear as the most happy country. It's interpretable. I think we may have hypotheses, but it's very difficult to interpret. But one needs objective data, and I think we lack objective data, maybe more than subjective data. And one needs questions and data on practices and activities. We need this triad, these three aspects of survey research. I must say here that in France, we have a very strong separation between research, survey research that is being done in institutes, in private institutes, that is poll and market institutes, and public statistics. Public statistics in France, like in Norway, like in Nordic countries, Finland, etc., is very strong. We have a very strong public statistics. It's also the case in Brazil. You have a very strong institution here. And in France, I don't know here in Brazil if it's exactly the same. I don't think so, knowing the work by Luca, for example, that you have a separation in France that is really a separation between private and public, but also attitudes and opinions on one side, facts on the other, objective facts on the other, which is a bit strange because we should integrate and we should have an analysis that understands relations between both. And that's the issue for us, I think. This is also an opposition between very large and representative samples that are constructed on the basis of a very long history of structuration of the norms of the profession, very standardized, with very strong professional norms on the public side, and much smaller samples with ad hoc categories that are used in one survey but not on the other, more flexibility on the surveys on the other side. But if one looks at objective data, especially data on resources, what do we see? We see something that is very important. We see the fact that surveys are insufficient. They are insufficient, especially to understand the concentration of wealth at the top levels now. A general survey, general population survey, doesn't allow you to understand what is really happening with the 1%, 0.1%, and so on. That's the Piketty argument, which is very strong. I think it's an argument against surveys as a tool to analyze wealth and the distribution of wealth and income. One should complement with other types of data. So one should use questionnaire surveys, but complement them with especially registered data. Tax data, for example, are also very important. In some cases, it's clear that survey research based on questionnaire is not the best tool to get objective information. We need a lot of other tools. We need a lot of other methodologies. Even in the case of elections, electoral prediction, opinion in politics for parties and so on, there is a debate now which relates to the book by Cagé and Piketty. So they just published a book which is based on the pure registered data in politics, which is the votes at the level of local communities, at the level of the commune in France, that is the level of municipalities. And these data, they are very strong in a sense. Of course, there is fraud, there is electoral fraud. In many countries, they are not that good. But in the history of France, this data have solidified. I mean, data that are produced by the state through elections are quite good. And you can correlate them with data that you get from census at the same level. And so you have a tool that allows you to overcome all the limitations of surveys. Of course, there is the ecological paradox issue that you don't have data at the individual level for votes. It's a problem. So you have to use data at a very detailed level. So we have here the problem of inequality, the problem of what is the appropriate tool to analyze inequality. I want to say a few things on that point. There is a big debate for me in social sciences, and typically most of economics thinks that income plus maybe diploma, level of education is enough. You don't need to use indicators such as social class or socioeconomic groups, something that relates to professional environments, to living and working conditions that are, for some of these economists, not adding an explanatory power to their regressions and to the analysis. And I think they're wrong, and we have good elements to say that they're wrong. We need information about social classes. maybe much more than theory about social classes. There are a lot of competing theories, and there are a lot of classes about theories of stratification, theories of social classes, and so on, the criteria. But we lack data. Actually, we don't have sufficient data on that. And it's the case, it was typically the case in Europe, where, sounds quite strange, we have unified the money, the currency, in 20 countries now in Europe. We have a standardization of the market of goods and services, which is very strong, and it's criticized for that because it's sometimes very strict as a regulation, as a regulatory framework. But we don't have a unified social class scheme in Europe. We didn't have, actually. We now have, because as I told you, I had the chance to participate to an innovation, which was the creation of a nomenclature at the European level, which is called the ESSEG nomenclature. So I will say a few words on the ESSEG nomenclature now, which for me is an interesting experience because it shows the power of the statistical institution when it wants to do something. I mean, it's really something that is really important. We have to keep that in mind, that we as sociologists and social scientists have clearly an alliance with the good quality of data produced by state agencies. And it's clear that the fact that the INSEE, so it's the name of the National Statistical Institute, the official institute, wanted to connect to the academic world was very important, because now there is this idea that one should discuss together, one should not do the things separately. The production of surveys should be done jointly with reflections coming from both sides, and academics should be consulted when innovations are made as regards survey, and especially here as regards the coding of socioeconomic groups. So that was a very interesting experience for me, where I just give precisions here, but the idea was, of course, we shouldn't spend too much money with that, so we should not create a lot of new questions. And that's the reason why a previous attempt made by British colleagues, it's a bit ironical now because they left the European Union, had proposed, on the basis of the analysis of Goldthorpe and the tradition of EGP classification, a classification which cost too much money at that time. So that's the reason why Eurostat didn't support this innovation, and the French took the leading role in the dynamics, and they proposed a classification which is a balance between the ESSEC classification from the British group and the spirit of the French classification, which is called the catégorie socio-professionnelle, profession et catégorie sociale, to be strict. An interesting experience, because personally I discovered the quality of the system of surveys at the European level, which is not that well known. We have big surveys, labor force surveys, which are very good. We have the EU Silk data, which is a system of information on social exclusion and the poor, which is really very, very, very good, very interesting, and from which we did a lot of analysis. And I think we need to invest really as social scientists in that kind of data, doing secondary analysis, using the data that are available through these surveys. Just to be a bit more precise about the ESSEG scheme, it's named ESSEG. So you have here the countries that were involved. Only 4 countries were really very involved in the production of this nomenclature. This is also important because this classification is part of something that exists, which is very professionalized, which is the system of statisticians of labor, and the professional group of public statisticians, which has edicted a lot of technical norms to produce good quality information. You have here the class scheme. I will not comment it because it's not the object today, but there are 2 levels. Level 1 is very simplified, looks very much like the French catégorie socio-professionnelle. And we know, Lucas has worked on that, but that it's adaptable to other situations, including Brazil. And that kind of tool, which is produced in the public system, which is stabilized with normalization, with some standardization, is really, for us, a resource that we should build our work upon. Here is the detailed level. I can tell you more if you want in the discussion. Just to show you that it relates to a lot of current work on transnational research, because to do transnational research, we need to have some standardized tools. Typically for education, we have the ISCED, but it's not very standardized. And that's a big problem because we know that education systems are very specific. They are part of the national genius. I mean, every country has its own specificity, very various types of levels of diplomation processes, very national context-based procedures, and how to construct something that is really helpful in international comparison and which makes sense in a transnational perspective. ESSEG, typically for me, is a good innovation, and one should probably reflect on a similar perspective for international comparison, including, I think, and maybe that will frighten some of you, but including for ethnographic or qualitative research. I mean, the idea of standardization is not necessarily normalization in the control sense. It's also a way to produce data, social facts that are more solid than the example of the questions on happiness. It's an example of success of the standardization, but I don't think it's the best standardization. That's the point. But it's clearly an example of wonderful success of a standardization. Everybody uses the same scale, 0 to 10. Okay, now to go a bit further, EU Silk survey is, for me, one of the best examples of an interesting surveys on which you can do a lot of things. It's a very large sample, many thousand persons in every country. Even the smallest countries, you have more than 10,000 persons, so it's very large. It's based on a very strict, normalized data collection process. You have a guideline which is very, very long. There are a lot of weights that are produced. There are a lot of documentation on that. It's very standardized, very rigorous. It's standardized over time, which allows you to have a series, which is very important, without ruptures in your series, which is also very important. You can create visualization of your data thanks to that. To get to a visualization of your data over time, you need at least standardization over time. You need to have things comparable over time. That's important. But, and also, very important element, it's the basis for social indicators in Europe. So for a social policy, of course, a social policy which is basically benchmarking between countries. That's the way social policy is done at the European level, because there is no real European level of social policy. Social policies are produced by the member states. And what do we do at the European level? We standardize the analysis and we produce an expertise, and regularly we assess, we evaluate the results of social policies of countries with a benchmarking logic. That is, the countries have to adopt the best practices and to do the reforms that allow to get the better results in terms of rate of employment, for example, and things like that. That's the way it's done. But it's very good data on social exclusion. It's very standardized. It's very interesting and very useful for sociologists. The point is that it's very limited for the study of the middle classes, for example, because it focuses on social exclusion. So you have a lot of information on poverty, material poverty of conditions, monetary poverty as well, but not real information on lifestyles, on practices. It's very, very poor, very limited. And so it cannot really allow you to distinguish what people do and the context in which they live once they have had access to a certain level of wealth. So anyway, it shows a picture that is quite relevant. I show you here a graph. It's the first GDA that I show, but I will not comment it very long. But on the first axis, you have an opposition on the left between the well-off, the one that have good conditions. They have no problem at all to make ends meet, for example. They live very easily. And at the opposite, you have people that don't even have a washing machine or a car for economic reasons. So there is clearly an opposition on the first axis, which is an opposition of social exclusion. What is interesting is that, of course, it allows you to have a comparison between countries with the mean points. Here you have the mean points of countries, and you see that Norway is in the best condition. So if maybe they are not the most happy, but in terms of avoiding social exclusion, they are clearly the well situated, the best in terms of situation here. You have countries that are very good, like Sweden, Nordic countries. Maybe they don't have the level of subjective happiness that is always the best, but they have achieved something which is to largely eradicate high social exclusion. Largely, I don't say totally, but if you look at the graph, it's really impressive, especially compared to the right part. And you can cross with time, so you can see, for example, we are working on that with a colleague now, the evolution and the downgrading of Greece, which has been terrible during the 2010s. With official data, you can show the results of austerity policies in social exclusion and poverty in some countries. So it's really, surveys are really very important, and the ability to use them in public debate is very helpful. And just to, just to come back to ESSEG, you see here a problem with the nomenclature at the European level is the fact that it creates categories that are rather heterogeneous in terms of social exclusion. That is, even for the group 1, that is the managers, you have a dispersion that is not very strong, but that is not very small as well, on the first axis, showing that there are people in this group that are in situation of social exclusion, especially in countries like Greece or some Eastern countries, because of course it's related to the situation of countries. And so there is an heterogeneity of social classes in Europe, which is very strong, and we show that. We have tools that are appropriate to show this diversity, because behind the ellipses that you see, you have the individuals. A country, it's a set of individuals, and you can project the mean point, but you can also project the ellipses. Here for the classes, I projected the ellipses to show you the mean points are ordered as they should. Being a manager is clearly, statistically, having a much better situation than being in the working class, and especially the less qualified fractions of the working class, that's group 7. But there is a strong heterogeneity. So here in that kind of graph, you have a picture of the diversity of situations in Europe, and I think it's a very powerful tool to make the data visible, to visualize the data. Okay, just to go a bit quicker now, and I will move to Invent finally, which is to some extent why I'm here for, speaking about our recent project. Precisely, we wanted to avoid to find a balance. Our goal, our initial goal, at least in the French group, was to avoid the imbalance between a purely survey that would be, for example, purely centered on attitudes and very subjective, or collecting only capital data, I mean objective data on inequality. And the idea is to try to integrate that kind of data and to produce a rational interpretation of the relations, of the connections of this. We wanted also to avoid something that is very important in Europe, that is the use of surveys to legitimize institutions. The example being the Eurobarometer, very well known, very standardized. There are 2 standard Eurobarometers a year. It's a very important survey in Europe, but it's very political in the sense that it's a tool not to measure happiness, even if there is a question on life satisfaction, but it's not used for communication on that. It's used for communication on confidence in institutions. And in which institutions, of course, European institutions first. It has been created, really, Philippe Aldrin has shown that in a famous paper. The survey itself has been created to legitimize European institution and European construction. So we wanted also to avoid that. We should not do that. As academics, we should have a much more critical way of asking questions or having questions in mind. And we had examples. So doing especially the questionnaire, producing our questionnaire, we had examples of the ESS, European Social Survey, very important. Many questions that we finally chose are very close to the ESS. Unfortunately, I think probably there are too many questions that are replication of ESS questions in our survey. But we wanted to have new types of questions. And there is always a problem, which is if you want the comparability, you need to have similar questions. So for example, you need the question on happiness between 0 and 10 because you want to compare. And say, oh, is it? But at the same time, we should do new things and we should investigate new realities. And so we should not be completely stuck in the reproduction of former practices. And I think it's important. So finally, we tried to find a balance. That was an arbitrage. That was really a balance. Discussions were very strong. And I can say that in the group, there were colleagues that were more favorable to questions on social capital, for example, on even economic capital as elements that are central in our survey, and others that were a bit more reluctant and thought that it would be more important to add a question on specific values or to have the question on religion, for example, because we had a focus which was very broad in this INVENT project, very large, because the idea was, in a sense, to follow the agenda of the European Union, which defines culture as part of the well-being. Again, happiness is present. It was in our in the environment of our project. We have to think of the societal or social values of culture. To what extent culture may be a vector of inclusion or not, in the context of megatrends, how it's coined in the project. Those megatrends being growing social inequality, population diversity, the rise of populism in Europe, which is very strong. Now we have really a trend which is really rapid and very impressive towards populist ideas, and especially right-wing populist ideas. New technologies, of course, are behind our study, because online and offline practices develop. Do they develop the same way? Are they coherent? Are they in opposition or not? That was part of the questions we wanted to deal with. Changing lifestyles, consumption patterns, power relations in all sectors were part of the context that we wanted to investigate. There are 9 teams. There were 9 teams. The project is over now. We are finished. We are producing the final reports. So I just don't comment, but it's the way we do European projects funded by the Commission. You join various countries. There must be some diversity. If not, you don't get the funding, because you need some diversity. It's not a representative picture of Europe, and that's a problem, because you have the countries that you have in the project. So necessarily the analysis is limited to the countries that you have connected with for the project. And in a sense, that can appear as a limitation. But as an argument in favor of that kind of work, we can say that usually that kind of projects, they reproduce, they reflect the diversity of countries. You necessarily have countries from the south. You necessarily have one country at least from the east. If you have an Nordic country, you also must have southern countries and so on. Here are the goals. I will not comment. It's general elements of language, as we say in French, of the Commission. There is a very strong rhetoric of the European Commission, and we wanted to use the context of the idea of putting culture at the front in a policy of social inclusion as an element that allows us to get good information, good data, to analyze social stratification in relation to cultural practices. What is the content of the research itself? Just a few elements here. There is a survey, properly speaking, a questionnaire survey with 14,000 interviewees. That's not so much compared to EU Silk. It's very, very low. And done by private institutes. Academic researchers are obliged to use the service to buy, in a sense, the work of companies that produce the data, which is a problem. But here in this case, we had the control of the questionnaire. That is, they had no intervention at all on the content of the questionnaire. The questionnaire was our redaction. We really wrote everything, and they didn't change a word. But they did the passation, and in a sense, we discovered the limits and the difficulties of survey research today, including the difficulties relating to the fact that in some countries you have only physical interaction to get a survey. In other countries you have only digital information. That is rather heterogeneous. So you have many limitations that come from the reality of conditions in every country. We thought at the beginning that we could hire a single company, European company, to do the survey the same way everywhere. that was not possible. We were surprised by that. So we had specific surveys by national companies. That was easier finally, which contradicts the idea that at the moment it's easy to do things at the European level. It's not. I mean, in the field of survey research, it's rather difficult. But there are a lot of other tools that have been used in this study in parallel, but I will not comment on them. But you see that qualitative research is very important, that focus groups, which is part of qualitative research, were present in our research, especially for specific types of actors. And we had also case studies, very important, to document innovations in the cultural sector. We had technological innovation for survey research, like the smartphone study, very important. Lucas could tell a lot on that because he was very much involved in that, which is a new type of survey with a limited number of people, but a lot of information at the level of individuals. It's not exactly a continuous information, but it tends to that direction. You know, it's a bit more experimental, and it has been used in medicine, in psychology. So there is now a lot of new tools. The problem of the project, to sum up, is that we promised to the Commission, to the European Commission, that we would do a lot, that we would produce a lot of data in a short period of time, and it's very much time-consuming. It's very hard. We managed to produce a lot of data, but it doesn't leave you the time to always interpret them correctly. I will say that like this. So here are the information about the survey that we did in France. You see that there is a distinction between CAWI and CATI, that is telephone interviews and web interviews. The average duration, it's very small, it's very short, actually, it's a short survey. And you have the content of the survey here, so the themes. And what was important is, what is the major innovation I will stress, is the fact that we had elements of attitudes, sometimes open-ended questions, but also elements of practice, which have allowed us to produce analysis comparing, for example, the space of online and offline practice. I just show you a graph to show you an example of results that we have now. That is a survey where we have the three types of information that I mentioned at the beginning. That is information on attitudes, and especially a new type. It's not completely new, but we have thought that it was particularly important for this survey, which is the open question. I will come back to that. Data on attitudes, classical data on attitudes. Information about capitals, I will come back to that. Information about positions, occupations, and so on. And information on practices. Finally, some interesting new trends in international survey data. And I will finish with that very rapidly, showing you the way we proceed, but I will not enter in the comment. I think what we should do more is to develop meta-studies, that is to compare systematically the results. And here it's, in a sense, the conclusion of my discussion on happiness, because we have results that are apparently completely contradictory, or largely contradictory, which are very different. But the reasons are, in a sense, we can find the reasons. There are good reasons for that. They relate to the context, they relate to the way the questions are asked, and so on. But what we lack is a sense of what they do in medicine or in experimental research, to have systematic meta-studies trying to help us understanding why we have so different results. And I think, for example, with all this burgeoning field of distinction studies, that we should do that we should do very good meta-studies in parallel with new work and new data collection. I think that would be really... We have already done that to some extent, but we've seen with Modesto Gallo this week that there is a lot of work done now in Iran, in Chile, in various countries. And what we lack is a systematic comparison of the data, not at a superficial level, because everybody does that in papers, and we mention we have this result. We sometimes give a table with that kind of data, but very systematic investigation of the comparison of the data. That is what I call a meta-study. That's the first element. The second element of novelty for me is to develop this social space approach that is, in a sense, very powerful to connect, especially qualitative and quantitative data, connect the level of individuals, the level of variances, that is of dispersion, and the level of average and means, which is also important. When you compare countries, you compare means, but we know that what is important is the dispersion, and that the dispersion is very multidimensional. That's the other keyword, multidimensionality. I think we have tools to investigate, to explore systematically the multidimensionality of our societies, and to admit that we are sciences of complexity, but not maybe the way some theoreticians say everything is complex, but taking seriously the fact that we should try to simplify a complexity, but simplifying it on the basis of appropriate tools that do not reduce to oversimplistic definitions. And again, I have in mind the example of happiness. Finally, what has been a good experience, I think, of the INVENT project was the fact that we thought that it was very good to have that kind of open questions and to connect answers to open questions to interviews, qualitative interviews, analysis of trajectories. I will not present that in depth. I will just show you things that you can do. So, of course, we can do something that is the easy way to standardize the information. What did we do for that? To translate everything into English. Okay, but that's you lose a lot of information with that. And that's the thing that was done at the level of the consortium. And after that, what do you do? Typically, you see the question, what comes to mind first when you think of the word culture? Please elaborate. People give words. And you do, today, topic modeling. You use LDA techniques, LDA models. That is clustering techniques, which allows you to say, well, we have these clusters, and you can compare. Lucas did this analysis, it's present here, and you can compare. For example, here, what is quite interesting is the fact that in France, the topic on culture as cultivation, that transforms the self, that transforms the personality, is more important than in most of the countries except Spain. Very important, and it's something that relates to an intuition that we have, that it's a topic that is very important. But we can do more, and we think that you should first analyze textual data in the natural language in which they have been produced. I think for me it's quite natural to think that when you have a linguistic approach of your data, a social linguistic approach, that you lose a lot if you translate, because translation is always treason, I don't know, but deformation, something that creates bizarre things. So you can first explore the data using typical of the tool kit that we use, correspondence analysis. This method has been developed for textual data and is very appropriate to analyze textual data, especially from open questions. Since Benzekri, it has been developed since many years. And we can apply to that also clustering techniques. And we don't use the LDA techniques, we use the agglomerative hierarchical clustering, which is a technique that fits more with the GDA paradigm. So you see here the multidimensionality, it's very strong. You have a number of terms or words, if you prefer, which is very important. That's something that for me is very important, is the fact that the reality is very multidimensional. And if you look at language, it's obvious. You have a lot of words, you have a lot of complexity, of syntactic complexity of language. So the best way, in a sense, is to admit that and to argue in favor of an inductive exploration of the patterns of data. There are some cliches here, but there are some frozen formula, for example. That's a notion of discourse analysis, and people just repeat frozen formula that they have heard about culture. But it's something where there is a lot of variability of answer. When you ask people to freely elaborate, there is a lot of variability, and there is something that is closer to what they really are and what they really do, in a sense. At least that's what we guess and what we think. But again, there is the issue of standardization. And here, in the example that I will present, the lemmatization, that is the reduction of forms to a single form, a coding of the forms. For example, cinemas in the capital letters is the same as cinema not in capital letters. It's a choice. We could have done the contrary, that is to let forms differ because they are different. They didn't write the same word. But we decided here to standardize with the use of lemmatization. It's a choice. Why is it interesting? Because it allows you to have less words and to have analyses that are more simple. You have here the cloud of individuals. You have here the cloud of words. I will not comment them, just showing you that on the left, you have clearly an opposition on the first axis between the classical vision of culture with genres like cinema, etc. On the right, two poles, which are one down below, one to the top, which is an opposition between intelligence, freedom, pleasure, openness, curiosity, etc., down below, and costumes, tradition, group, values, everything that in a sense relates to transmission and to patrimony, a patrimonial, an identity vision of culture. What is interesting is that the fact that you can investigate the relation between these words and social characteristics of the locutors. And you see here that, for example, you have clearly, not that clearly, it's not that clear. The effects are not so strong. But the first axis, which relates to diploma and capital and cultural capital, and the second axis that relates more to age, and in a sense also to social conditions, with students being down below. And if you remember, the young, and especially the young men, are on the side of culture, pleasure, freedom, intelligence, and so on. So that's interesting to see who says what, who answers what, and to investigate the complexity of patterns that are produced on various axes. Just finish with that, showing you that we have a lot of tools to investigate the complexity of these answers. And I will finish saying that the context of open data now and the growing accessibility of data, and not only questionnaire data, are in a sense favorable to the development of social sciences, but provided you maintain a line of reflexivity, of critical analysis, not thinking that we have a single tool that allows you to do everything. Maybe for that purpose, I've just mentioned the meta studies, but I have had another idea, which is we should develop challenges like they do in statistics and applied mathematics. They have data challenges. You give data to groups and they elaborate on the data. We should do that, but from a sociological interpretative point of view. We should have interpretative challenges. What will you propose with this data set that is really new and that is really consistent, that allows our knowledge of the reality to improve? You will say it's probably that we do when we publish research in journals, but we could develop that kind of attitudes toward the data. Finally, I think that the dynamics of international cooperation, collective research programs, projects, and so on, creates a new set of possibilities to improve the quality of our data at the international level. And that's really something that we should develop together, while maintaining the contextual specificity, not forgetting our languages, for example. I'm sorry, but I say that in English. It's not exactly, it's a bit contradictory, okay. It is particularly important when speaking about cultural and linguistic issues, which are very important when it's about the space of attitude or the symbolic spaces that we investigate, to speak like Loïc Vacan. A few references, that's the references that I mentioned, and muito obrigado pela atenção. Too long?
Okay. Thank you very much, Professor Lebaron. Will be very quick in my, because I want you open for anyone who wants to question anything, all right? So I think we have to do, sabe quanto tempo, Zé? Não? Alguém sabe? Quanto tempo tem? Está marcado 6:30? Ok. 6h45, pode? Pode, não? 15 minutes, okay? 15 minutes? No problem, please. No, it's just that, well, when we came up with this idea to bring up this seminar, it was exactly with this that's exactly what we had in mind. It's like how is to work in international research, because we talk a lot about internationalization. But when we talk about internationalization, usually we come up with some ways of measuring internationalization, but we never think about how to create and to produce research that are actually produced globally, internationally. We do that sometimes with comparative research. So we take what in Brazil was done, what in France was done, and then we compare. And when we were talking in January and we were discussing the event with Lucas, and well, it was really striking how you managed to put together a research that was actually international, and that's very rare. And that's why I proposed to bring you here to discuss that. Because it's something totally different when you have to choose a category that can be used in a questionnaire, in a survey, that can be understood in different countries. Because we are discussing in France in January our questionnaire, and we were saying, well, it's very hard to have a category that different social class can understand. And then Lucas and you said, well, we have people from 9 countries that should understand the same question. And that's really hard to do. So my questions will be very focused on micromanagement of this sort of research, and not in the data that you brought. Because at the same time that it brings lots of possibilities, it brings also lots of challenges. And I want to talk about the challenges. So the first thing, like in a more general sense, you talk about what you call a global social space. And I want you to share a little bit with us how you see that when you are working in a transnational network, in terms of, well, people come from different countries with different institutions and different possibilities to carry out the research. Like you said, well, we couldn't have the same company, the same firm to apply the questionnaire all around. So you had to choose different companies. Probably the countries, they had different conditions to finance the research. So how do you cope with these differences in terms of the methods you're going to choose for different countries? And also, in a way, how do you deal with the power relations? Because, of course, and I'm not just talking about your research, but thinking about your experience. Of course, different countries, different intellectuals, different researchers, they have different conditions to work together to cooperate in global, in transnational research like this. So that's my first question.
Do you want me to answer rapidly?
I think I will be very quick because, well, let's see if we have a little bit of time. And I also want to ask you about the categories. You're talking about the survey, and then you gave one example of the choices they could have in terms of what they like hip hop, etc., etc. Like in this research, how it was the process of choosing from different countries with different cultural traditions, what really mattered to have in the same questionnaire. Because as I understand, the possibility of answering is an open-end question, what is culture? It was part of the questionnaire, right? The questionnaire wasn't based on open-ended questions. So that's also my question. If you believe that, because you're talking about mixed methods in the beginning of your presentation, if you can use this sort of open-ended questions to build the questionnaire and not to be part of the questionnaire, because then I can imagine you would have categories that are more precisely related to different realities. That's the other question. And I got lost in my notes. And I like it very much, this idea of meta-analysis of the researches. And if you have a little bit more to talk about, because it's something that's really urgent, because we usually talk about researches according to their results, but we don't really know how the data were collected, analyzed, categories were built. And well, in the field that we work, it's very problematic all the time. So I think you can react to my talk, and then we open for a little bit.
Very rapidly to,
I think it's.
I will react very rapidly to let you the floor. As regards the money, it's a European project. We had a lot of money, and every country had enough money to have a company doing the survey. What we discovered is the fact that the prices were very different, and the practice were very different, and it allowed some countries to have a direct physical interaction to produce the data, whereas in other countries you had to limit and to stick to digital data collection through the web. So finally, that was not that homogeneous. That was the first observation for me, which was a surprise, that we didn't standardize the interaction. So creates an heterogeneity of the data and discussions in the French group. We were a bit surprised by that, but we had to deal with that. And the ones that were in the best conditions were the ones where the prices were the lowest. So the Serbs and the Croatians, the Croats, they had better conditions in the sense that they could have much more larger sample, much is the quality proportional? I'm not sure. I mean, it's complex too. There is a lot of discussion about data quality in questionnaires, and we have some doubts, and we have some bad surprise with some samples. I will not cite the country, but there is one country where obviously there was a big problem of bias of the sample with people with a high level of education. And clearly, it's because the company, which was the same as I think it was the same as our company, but didn't do the same at all in terms of practice. So you discover that as well, the fact that the national companies of the same group, they don't have the same practice of survey research. That's the first point. So creates heterogeneity and complexity, and I think it's a lesson of that. One should have conditions that allow to have more homogeneous conditions of passation for a survey. And I think here the model is the National Institute of Statistics, because they know how to do that. They really have conditions that open up. As regards the open-ended question, I agree. I agree with your suggestion that should be a first part of a research, that we really investigate thoroughly an open-ended question before producing a more closed questionnaire, because we limited, I think, to only one question, which is really open-ended in our questionnaire, or maybe two, but I think there is one. And the reason was it costs too much. You cannot have an entire questionnaire with that kind of questions. It's much too difficult to deal with. Creates so there was this argument. We, the French group, were in favor of more open-ended questions. To tell you the truth, meta studies. Okay, I think we first have to do replication exercises. We do not do enough of that, including with historical research that have been analyzed and which have given birth to big books and a lot of articles. And I think this culture of replication, which has become very spread, widely diffused in the scientific field in general, should be present in our community. And I think we should do that much more. And that's not that difficult at the age of open data and very facilitated access to the data sets now. And we have also tools that allow you to do analysis with very large data sets. I mean, it's very easy. It's much easier than it was in the 60s or 70s. So we should do that and have a relation to data that is less, it's my data and I don't want. And for example, we in Europe are obliged to communicate our data at least 6 months, I think, after the end of the project. our data will be public. So if you want to work on the invent data, you can do that. It will be. It's 3 years? No. For invent? Are you sure of that? Okay. It's a bit more than what I guessed. I thought.
Ok. Bom, agora quem quiser fazer perguntas em português, por favor. Se quiserem fazer em inglês, façam em inglês, mas podem fazer em português falando devagar. Alguém tem perguntas? Por favor. Bom, talvez, vamos ver, talvez você tenha que descer.
Yeah, if I understood well, I think you're right. There is resistance to updating the teachings in computer tools and methodology in general, and quantitative methodology. I think we should do more. And many departments of sociology all over the world, I think there has been a lack of investment in this, and I think it creates a situation where we are in difficulties when we are discussing with official statisticians or economists, clearly. And whereas I think it's very important in terms of producing reflexive and high quality analysis. We cannot say, well, we stick to qualitative analysis. I think it's very important that we produce original and innovative qualitative analysis, but that should be complemented and done in parallel with more quantitative analysis of various kinds. I mean, using all sorts of data that we can produce. That's really something I think strategic for us. Thank you. Thanks a lot. It's something that I didn't mention, but for me, there are a lot of limitations of purely national statistics, of course. And it's important that there is also an activist movement of production of alternative statistics. It's sometimes coined as stat activism or things that are produced by NGOs, etc. So what I wanted to present is the opposition between the objective data on one side and the type of so-called subjective data that develop like around the happiness community, happiness research community. But I agree that part of the game should be an alliance between academic scientists and NGOs and people who are acting on the ground who are able to produce quality information that is in capacity of contesting some of the decisions or the arbitrary limitations of official statistics and decision. So clearly it's a political tool as well for me. And it's a political tool that is not limited to public policies produced by statists or public institutions, clearly. That can also be parallel and more activist. And so in the picture that I produced, I probably forgot a bit this side, which is very important for me as well. I participated to actions, especially regarding issues related to well-being or inequality, to produce from different statistics new indicators that would be, and I think it's probably one of the weaknesses of the social movements, is their inability to discuss with serenity of the idea that it's important to have very good indicators that you produce with good data visualization of quality that is certified by scientists, that is discussed, because you're much stronger. You're much stronger when you're facing someone in a debate or in a struggle or in any occasion where you're fighting with people most of the time. And symbolically, I mean, I don't want to enlarge. And I think it's important to also have in mind that producing good surveys may be a way of improving the situation of people, and that can be produced with them. And that's partly in the spirit of the Stiglitz and Fitoussi reports at the origin, I mean, at least the most radical ones in the group, to say that people should participate to the production of statistics which concerns them. And I think it's true. I think that should be something shared in a sense. We should be able to say something to in the process, and that's important. That's why it's important to also have qualitative analysis such as focus groups or things like that to correct the results of a survey that appears to be too distant or too official to people. And thank you.
Bom, então acho que a gente vai fechar, né? Agora tem uma assembleia. No, it was really good. Muito obrigado pela sua palestra, pela conversa. Queria agradecer também a vocês que estão presentes, a tradução, muito obrigado, ao apoio técnico, Zé, Gabriel, é isso?
Muito obrigado.
Muito obrigado, gente. Obrigado ao Unicamp por acolher a gente aqui também.